Good afternoon, Jags. This is Fahad. Today is Thursday, August 6th. I have a Chronicle here with me. This is going to be a second series of, or second episode of the series called Chinese Tech Demystified that we are doing on Jaguar Media platform. And in this particular case, we're going to discuss these two stocks called Huya and DouYu. Hi, Chronicle. How are you doing?
Doing good, Fahad. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. I just absolutely love these presentations. And this series has been so powerful. We discussed Pinduoduo a couple days ago, a couple weeks ago, I should say. That stock has been on a tear. This time we're going to discuss these two, and then I'm sure there's more coming. This is the second episode of the series. The fun part is that these stocks are so not understood well in the market, and there's so much to learn about what's going on in the Chinese tech space and how they're benefiting from trends that are so powerful in nature. That's why I love these presentations, because we bring such a high quality content that really touch upon so many ideas that are simply not in people's view. And you have done tremendous work on this
Started.
one.
Before,
Chronicle, tell me about it.
sure. So these two companies are basically the biggest Twitch equivalents in China. They're the providers of game live streaming and esports solutions. DouYu roughly translates to fighting fish on the next slide, while Huya even more roughly translates to tiger tooth, which is why their logo is a tiger with teeth. And in terms of where these companies are today, DouYu has about 165 million monthly active users. Huya has 150, and Twitch, by comparison, has 140. If you're interested in knowing how both of these companies started off, that's on page 1 of the attached research note. And on the next slide, you can see the snapshot of what the industry looks like currently. All the
Imagine,
important
hold on a sec. Imagine an American tech company, an internet company, naming itself Tiger Tooth or Fighting Fish. Anyways, on the next slide.
So all the important numbers are here on the screen, but what I will add is that 2019 was a very difficult year because of a lot of strict regulations that were implemented by, like ISBN licensing and enforced ID restrictions and in-game purchasing restrictions. And you can read all about that on pages 1 and 2. But basically what happened was that China's State Administration of Press and Publication, they were given authority over digital games regulations in 2018, and they immediately started to crack down on the industry, which resulted in a freezing of a lot of new game approvals for 9 long months. So that suppressed the Chinese market in 2019, which resulted in the US overtaking China to become the world's biggest market. But looking ahead, game approvals have started to come back, and game downloads have improved in recent quarters. Currently, the Chinese gaming market as of June is being forecast to grow at above 20% CAGR through 2025, which would imply overtaking the US to regain top spot this year or next.
Staying on the Chinese state of the industry for gaming, there was a period, if I remember correctly, it was back in 2016 when the government came down hard on a lot of publishers, game publishers, because they were worried that the kind of content that was being put out was going to be pretty negative for youth development, and as a result, many of these companies were hit hard one by one. Tencent was one of the biggest publishers at the time, and that period lasted for quite some time, for I believe for more than 2 years, and we saw the overall gaming industry suffered badly in China. Is that something that is a part of this discussion from here, particularly related to this slide? And then more importantly, have we seen a bit of a better turnaround emerge from that downturn, and then more and more lenient, government regulation, essentially, when it comes to these gaming publishers?
Absolutely. This is just the beginning, and these regulations, so this period from 2018 to 2019, they're going to play a huge part in Huya and DouYu's history and how they emerged to become a duopoly today.
Excellent. Moving on to the next slide. So tell me, how does the game live streaming in China looks like? And more importantly, the way I think about this, every time when I see live streaming, it's basically reminds me of what we see in the US, which is Twitch, owned by Amazon.
Yeah, so just very quickly, these are examples of what game streaming looks like in China. On the left side, that's what a typical live gaming screen looks like. So we can see the player on the bottom right of the screen. Of course, we have the game taking up most of the screen. And if you notice all those words flying across, those are live comments being posted by people who are tuning in to watch. So it's different from Twitch or North America, where messages are normally kept within a text box somewhere. And if you're wondering why people are typing a lot of sixes, there's nothing satanic about that. But what a bunch of sixes mean in Chinese slang is something along the lines of, wow, that's awesome. And on the right side, that's an example of live chatting, which is another way people have been using these platforms. So a lot of people are using these live gaming platforms not to play games, but rather they're holding their own talk shows for people to tune into. And later on in the presentation, we'll see how this has gone on to create other subtrends.
Very interesting. I think we have similar kind of platforms that are very popular. It's skipping from my mind right now in the US too. And in fact, the IPO for that company is also about to come in the US, where this has become a powerful chat room for a lot of gamers in the US. Moving on, tell me more about it.
Sure. So very quickly, here we can see the live gaming, how the live streaming culture started off in China, and it was very slow to begin with. The only thing I'll add to this slide here is that in 2014, that was when Huya and DouYu split from their parent companies. Again, it's in page 1 of the attached note. And during these early years, the two companies were already among the industry leaders. And on the next slide, 2016 was really when the industry really began to take off. It was mainly the emergence of esports and competitive gaming. Basically, it's people competing against one another in video games while lots of people tune in to watch. And they eventually became live physical events where people actually go to stadiums where all these computers and large screens are set up. And they're basically watching professional teams compete against one another for cash prizes and trophies. And these cash prizes can go up to six figures. Like if we look at the top 10 professional esports teams in China, they've all raked in tens of millions of US dollars in career earnings, and they pretty much become celebrities. And so, with a lot of backing from the Chinese government, as well as corporations from Tencent and Alibaba, this was the year in which game live streaming went from being just 14% of total streaming in China to 23% by 2017.
This is crazy. I remember you showed us internally a picture that talked about the highest earners of these gamers in China, and the lifetime earnings of one of the best highest earners was $35 million accumulated all in the last couple of years, followed by several people with 30s and $20 million and such. It's crazy how these gamers, professional gamers, can actually go on to make a great living for themselves. So this is a big theme. I mean, if you look at these kind of stages and lights and watching in live big stream, esports is a huge theme, maybe even bigger in China than it is in the United States.
Certainly. And so on this next slide, with all that success, naturally a lot of new competition started to enter the fray. More specifically, over 100 competing live streaming platforms began emerging, as I detail on pages 3 to 5 of the attached note. And on the left, we can see the logos of some of the bigger competition that DouYu and Huya had to face. But the key thing here is that it quickly became a difficult environment because these new companies were burning large sums of cash to recruit all the top teams and famous streamers into using their platforms exclusively. And as we'll touch on later, it's not cheap to entice these people. And also, a lot of people were beginning to use the gaming platforms not just to play games, but or hold talk shows, but they also began using them to share other activities like singing or dancing or playing instruments. And if we look at the image on the top right, people are even using these platforms to hold educational tutoring sessions.
That's that's incredible. Once a streaming service basically takes off, it takes a life of its own. So you don't believe that these competitors that have emerged in the recent years are actually really a big competitive threat to the dominance that Huya has in this particular industry, or even Tencent for that matter, is going to be a major dominant player compared to what Huya has been able to accomplish with its unique platform.
So if we go to the next slide, this is where we start taking a closer look at Huya and DouYu. So amidst all that intense competition that you just described, both companies caught a bit of a lucky break in 2018 when Tencent decided to purchase stakes in both of them on the very same day. Tencent bought a 35% stake in Huya with an option to boost its control to 50.1%, and it has since exercised that option earlier this year. And then later on the same day, sorry, they bought a controlling stake in DouYu for 4 billion yuan. After that, both Huya and DouYu both changed their business strategy to not burn so much of cash, which I detailed in page 4 of the note, while at the same time, a lot of the other competition became insolvent from that very strategy because they were throwing a lot of money into the recruitment of superstars, as well as the increasing regulations that we talked about earlier, and the freezing of game approvals. That all combined to kill all of Huya and DouYu's competition during this year. And the biggest casualty was Panda TV, which was having, I think, about 80 million monthly active users at the time. And they had a loaded roster of famous streamers and esports teams. So when Panda TV went under, a lot of these famous stars with huge followings, they had nowhere to go. And so they had to migrate to Huya and DouYu without them having to fork a lot of monetary incentives. And they
Is
also brought along their audiences.
is Panda TV shut down for good now,
Yeah.
since that March 2019? So that's a very large population that had to go in other sources. So they all went to Huya and DouYu. Looking at your pie chart here, you add the two companies together, and we'll talk a little bit more down the slides about a potential merger that's coming between these two companies as Tencent is choosing to consolidate and spun them off. But looking at that pie chart, that's going to become a dominant force when you combine these two companies together, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, they're gonna control about 70% of the market, and the only major competition right now is probably Bilibili and Kuaishou, but they're in a different niche. I would put them in a separate, semi-relevant category.
I mean, maybe we are truly underestimating then the potential of what these two companies collectively can then accomplish. Most streamers than anyone else, that gives them pricing power. Maybe advertisements will also come on this platform. They will have the best library of tons and tons of new games, large esports or streaming business that's going to be dominant everywhere. In terms of, I don't know exactly what the combined value of the company will look like once the merger has gone, but I'm just thinking out loud. Maybe the market has not really fully forecasted or the potential here of how big that could really be in China. And then when you think or start thinking this way, maybe we are truly underestimating the potential of upside in stocks like Huya over the course of next year or 2 years. Moving on to your next slide, more fun stuff over here. So tell me about the revenues.
Sure. So before we touch on their financials properly, let's first take a look at how these companies make their revenues and what their biggest expenses are. So unlike Twitch, advertising doesn't represent a lot of revenue here. Instead, most of it comes from the purchase of virtual items. So basically, viewers are purchasing these items to serve as gifts to the streamers. So like in this first image here, this streamer is putting on a singing performance. And on the right edge, you can see some buttons that offer options to purchase a gift for the streamer. And the other method of generating revenue is cash donations and perk purchases. So many of these streamers, what they do is they offer perks in exchange for a minimum amount of gift and cash donations. Like this second image, we can see this particular streamer is offering 8 different tiers of perks. So for example, if you contribute 50 renminbi per month, you'll be able to get an occasional shout out from the streamer, and you'll also gain access to unique emoticons when posting comments. Meanwhile, if you contribute, say, 100 renminbi, then you go to a higher tier where you're allowed to directly private message the streamer a certain amount of time. So that's a simple explanation of how this works. And on the
How do
next slide,
this creates a very interesting relationship between the audience and the between the streamers and the game and the players, the top players particularly. But how does that translate into revenues for the company itself?
so the rev whatever whenever a person buys a virtual item, all of that goes to the company.
I
And on the
see.
next slide, we'll see the biggest expenses. So these platforms, the most of their costs come from having to share revenues with the streamers. So all of these virtual gifts that the viewers are buying, they're not nothing burgers. They actually contribute to the streamer's earnings. So Huya, after collecting all of its revenue, pays out 50% of its earnings, while DouYu pays out between 50 to 60%. Naturally, the smaller competition, the ones that all died in previous years, they had to offer much more, which increases the cash burn. The second largest expense comes from all the signing and recurring fees when contracting all of those famous streamers. So on the right, we can see some of the more famous streamers in China. For example, the slightly chubby one at the top, his nickname is PDD, and DouYu is currently paying him several $1 million a year to keep him on the platform because he has close to 100 million followers. And the one next to him, that's Hu Tongtong. She's famous for live streaming herself eating obscene amounts of food. And on the bottom right, that's Lauren Hallinan. She's an American who lived in China for almost a decade, and she's more famous in China than she is in the US. She was making a living live streaming her daily life in China. And apparently she's gone on to start a consulting firm that helps American enterprises navigate the Chinese online marketing trend.
It's incredible, incredible stuff. That's a lot of commission share, 50 to 60%, or just call it 50% between the two combined companies. And I think that's a major incentive for these gamers to continue to flock to the platform and continue to build out their following. Great stuff. Next one. This is where we get into financials.
Yep, so this section is all detailed in pages 6 and 7 of the write-up. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the only key thing I'll mention is notice how ever since the competition began dying in late 2018 and early 2019, the gross margins of both companies have turned higher. And as a result, net income is now turning positive because Huya and DouYu no longer have to burn so much cash, and meanwhile, top line continues to trend in the right direction. So if we look ahead, the growth is very promising if we consider how most of the competition is now dead and buried. 24.7% projected CAGR, and game streaming continues to take a bigger chunk of the entire Chinese streaming market. And meanwhile, global esports audience is expected to compound at 14%, with 57% of that coming from Asia. So nothing to dislike here in terms of projected growth.
You consider, when you simple in the simplest form, anybody looking at this as a potential investment opportunity in case of Huya, you think about a dominant player with most number of audience, most number of streamers and gamers, 24.7% CAGR over the course of several years, 70% market share in one of the biggest markets in the world for gamers. I mean, what's really not to like when someone just simply from a high level standpoint, this becomes a very, very strong fundamental case for the company for continuing upside in the
Sure.
stock price. Now, Let's talk about Tencent and what exactly is Tencent trying to do over here, consolidating the two companies, and what's the motive here and why?
Yeah, so this was a bit of misfortune on our part. We had prepared this write-up and presentation over the weekend, and then on Wednesday, this headline comes out from Bloomberg saying Tencent is considering a merger between these two companies. But to put it simply, if anybody is placing bullish bets on Huya or DouYu right now, chances are it's because they believe Tencent is going to merge them. And there is a strong case for that because we have to ask ourselves, why else would Tencent be buying controlling stakes in both companies? If the merger happens, the resulting entity will have 70% of the market share and a near impenetrable moat. There's still going to be some competition, as I said, from Kuaishou and Bilibili. But both of those are more for casual audiences and mobile bite-sized streaming. And also, if we think about it, the companies could also start sharing analytics and user data, Huya and DouYu, and that's going to result in new forms of monetization. Like I'm thinking large-scale targeted advertising for starters, and even refining their talent recruitment strategy. Or they could even start forming a mega agency or something along those lines. And meanwhile, from Tencent's point of view, they've always controlled every phase of the game development and game deployment cycles. But where they've been lacking in is the transmission and delivery cycle. This merger would fix that. We also have to think about how Tencent could make use of the analytics in its own game development projects, right? And it will also make any expansions outside of China more streamlined. I wouldn't be surprised if Tencent starts releasing some of its content exclusively through both platforms as well. So the possibilities are endless here for Tencent. They are the ultimate winner here, not Huya or DouYu. And last thing is, a couple months ago, June 11th, Beijing News published a remarkable article in which they cited multiple insiders who said that Tencent submitted a merger proposal for the two companies, something which Bloomberg later confirmed earlier this week on Wednesday. And we can see from the chart here that that initial article on June 11th from Beijing News, that was a bullish event for both stocks, and rightly so.
Story. Excellent presentation, Chronicle. Really love it. And every day, every time when we do this, I feel like I love so much. I learned so much from all of this discussion. Folks, as a reminder, this presentation will be presented at the Jaguar Media, and you can go there once it's uploaded and download the full article, write up, research note behind this, as well as all of these slides. And with that said, thank you very much. We will see you next time.